It's prefaced by Adam Gopnik, forward by George Dawes Green, and it is edited with an introduction by Catherine Burns. Last Friday, we spent some time with the Moth, but it was so enjoyable for me, and I hope for you, that we're going to spend a little more time with it today. I thought I would read the preface again because there was some confusion from a few folks. Well, I don't understand what the Moth is. Very briefly, it is telling stories to an audience. But let me clarify somewhat by reading the preface that was written by Adam Gopnik. Who knew that what New York needed was a front porch? That the secret desire hidden in the hearts of hipsters and banksters alike was a chance to sit after dinner in a screened-in space to escape, or maybe just enjoy the summer heat, and there, in the dark, lit by a single lamp with its attendant insects, swap stories, tell tales. Who knew that what we really wanted was one shared place where everyone, from a kid off the street to a cop just off the beat to Salman Rushdie, who could tell us about this weird thing that happened. Oh, did I tell you this already? No? Well, you remember that time I went round on Christmas to Uncle Norm's? Storytelling, story sharing, tale bearing in the good sense, yarn spinning. Who knew that what New York and now the nation, oh, we'll get there, needed was that? Well, the men and mostly women of the Moth knew. This book relates to what is itself an improbable story, a yarn spun, how the Moth sprang from a simple idea of George Green's, slowly grew, and then eventually became a national phenomenon. But the deeper questions are, why now? Why here? And above all, why does it work? What is it about this improbable form that the Moth has made its own and shared with the world, the timed, short, personal story, rooted in reminiscence and memoir, distinctly unprofessional, even when offered by a pro, that vibrates with its era? A lot of success has to do, as always in life, with much preparation and calculation beneath the seeming spontaneity. For all their seeming inconsequence and improvisational air, a good Moth story is as carefully prepped and cultivated as a bonsai tree, with the same understanding that the miniature form, oh, far more fragile than the bigger kind, needs more constant tending. You have a little stage space to waste in a 2-hour play, but there's not a second that doesn't have to count in a 10-minute story. The producers and directors of Moth Evenings, astonishing array of those mostly female overseers who somehow combine the role of effusive cheerleader and hard-headed theater critic, run the stories, work the stories over and over until that thing you hear, though never written down, is incised on the storyteller's consciousness for good, with all its inner twists and turns. That relentless preparation may be for the arrogant writer type who thinks he already knows all there is to know about storytelling, i.e., me. The most difficult, and then, in the end, the most rewarding thing about the moth process. A good story, we're reminded, is shaped, plotted, rehearsed. The best guy on the porch was planning his tale right through dinner. A good story needs an A plot and usually a B plot, and then, if it is to levitate the room, to use the lovely expression the women of the Moth use themselves, it almost always needs some last rising touch, a note of pathos or self-recognition or poetic benediction to lift the story, however briefly, into the realm of fable or symbol. Three more C's spring to mind to encircle the mystery of the moth. A lot of the magic of the moth story is confessional. Everyone likes to talk about himself, to be sure, but the stories we like to hear most are the ones that you would think we would be most unwilling to tell. The human need for confession in the presence of the others, left mostly untended by the churches these days, is fulfilled by the moth occasion. An uncanny number of the best moth stories are admissions, even apologies, frank, candid. I spent Christmas in a transgender bar. Or, when I was 14, I shot my friend by accident. And the audience listening implies by the perfect silence of their attention that they are rapt right there with you throughout. Even a self-humiliating moth story, one hears the rarest thing, the sound of an audience keeping an open mind. Then often laughter and always applause closes the circuit. The unspeakable or embarrassing thing admitted turns out to be not so bad, maybe even surprisingly commonplace. We didn't all insult James Brown or get busted making hooch in Attica, but life presents relentless difficulties and complexities and humiliations, even to the luckiest of us. And we applaud warmly as if to say, I know. The audience doesn't release its breath as it does at a high-tension tragedy, or applaud in culminated pleasure as it does in a good musical. No, the audience pauses, reflects for a bare half moment, and then erupts in the pleasure of not seeing a thing accomplished, but hearing a truth shared. Some ancient ritual of expiation seems to be taking place. Oh, that's okay. The exaltation says what happens to you, however hair-raising, in the Moth stories that have been told about escapes from prison, accidental shootings, and near-death experiences are now part of what has happened to us all. Now, the second C is that of comedy. Perhaps the hardest thing those Moth stories directors have to teach the storyteller is that the laughter will come only if there are no self-conscious jokes. This isn't stand-up, they say, in pleasant effect, to the guy who, with a microphone suddenly in his hands, wrongly thinks himself a second Seinfeld. Me, again. The laughter provoked by a Moth story has to be ethical laughter, not the laughter of a taboo transgressed, but the laughter of a truth revealed. And nothing is more helpful to a storyteller who may also be in Mufti, a pro-writer, than this reminder that the ethic of all storytelling is credibility, truth. Much has been made of the human need for narrative, but truth be told, stories don't make us better people, but they do make us truer writers. My own Moth experience came along, for instance, at a moment when I often felt mired in the damp, soggy marsh of the 4,000-word essay with its exhausting sapient certainties and predictable drop-cap caesuras. Edmund Burke was born in, quote unquote, the pressure of Moth storytelling made me newly aware of what propulsion can do for a paragraph. It reminded me that drama and pacing and even suspense could be wooed from the slightest materials, and that the key to good writing, well, one key anyway, is that the reader should never look back. Even Proust, for all his elaborating, is a spiraling, but not circular writer. We may move round and round, but we press ahead. Every essay is really a story, and every story, truth be told, shares the same ethic, the same motto. The great storyteller, Frank O'Connor, defined it best, saying once that every good story should end, in spirit, with the exact same words. I quote, "And everything that ever happened to me afterwards, I never felt the same about again," end quote. He actually got to use that ending once. In this book of Moth stories, that test of significance, of meaning, is met again and again. There are very few of these well-told tales that don't have those words as an invisible addition. You can mouth them to yourself as the story ends. Jesus, she could never have felt the same about anything after that. Confession, comedy, and then one last alliterative thing. Connection. Poetry and philosophy may be there to teach us in a sudden, stunning lurch of perspective the virtues of detachment. But storytelling, large and small, is there to teach us the beauties of attachment. The sweat and worry of a Moth evening nearly always ends with a sense of membership in a private club, but one shared by speakers and listeners. We wring each other's hands, not in sweaty acknowledgement, but in shared appreciation. Every story knits together with every other. It must. A small connection, a link in a chain. is always forged. I'll never feel the same again is the moral of every good story. We're all in this together is the moral of every Moth occasion. Of all the alchemies of human connection, sex and childbirth and marriage and friendship, the strangest is this. You can stand up and tell a story that is made entirely, embarrassingly, of eyes. And a listening audience somehow turns each eye into a me. This alchemy of self-absorption into shared experience is the alchemy of all literature. No one will ever know exactly how it happens, but however it happens, it is what makes the moth fly, too. Now, shall we flap some wings together? And by the way, you may have noticed a presence lurking. Well, Connor is being a professional cinematographer. He brought a microphone to the stage. So we're experimenting with all this technology. So that microphone, my best friend, at least for a half hour or so every Wednesday and Friday. Now, there are 50 stories in this book. I would like to read each of the 50 to you. I know that can't be done, but here's another one. Marvin Galfand wrote, Liberty Card. My story goes back 62 years to the autumn of 1940. Oh, I won't fill in the Blitz and Wendell Willkie running against FDR for the third term. The story, such as it is, took place in a sprawling borough by the sea. Brooklyn, in a neighborhood tucked into the northwest corner of the East River, known as Williamsburg, to distinguish it from Williamsburg, the colonial restoration. My parents were very late immigrants to the United States. My mother came with 9 siblings in 1930. My father had come in the 1920s. It seemed that side of the family never disclosed much. I have a feeling he did something infamous because World War I was involved and the borders changed, and then there was the Russian Civil War and Lenin attacked the Poles, and you know, God, it was terrible. Who knows what people did to survive? But he never told stories like Herbie Kleinman's father, who was a baker with a baker's great belly. You know, I sewed jewels into my underwear and I snuck out of Odessa. So they married, settled in Williamsburg, where my mother's family lived, where the Satma live now, the very pious Jews. My family was not pious in that energetic way. We lived in the part of Brooklyn that had row houses. Oh, not a tree grows in Brooklyn, Williamsburg. Betty Smith's Irish tenement, Williamsburg. But a row house that had been lived in by the Brooklyn bourgeoisies. It had been broken up into not floor-through apartments, but half floor-through, and we lived in a succession of them. I was overprotected. I was treated as if my parents had had a child before I came along, and that child had died. My parents had come here as much out of fear of what had happened as what was happening and what was likely to happen in Europe. Oh, they escaped the worst of it, but there was a mixture of hope, to be sure. America was called the Golden Medina, and there were so many great success stories. David Sarnoff, Eddie Cantor. You know, I could run the list now. But their fears were great. My father worked terribly hard, left early, came home late. Oh, I hardly ever saw him. He went along with my mother, who said, no Michael for him. Oh, no, we could afford it. We had boarders who helped pay the rent, like Mr. Lichtenstein, who was a retired watchmaker. So it wasn't the money, but a bicycle. You could fall. Roller skates. Well, the hills in Williamsburg weren't great, but there was an incline. And you'd lose control, and you'd be on Bedford Avenue with all those buses. And playing marbles in the gutter. Oh, that wasn't dangerous. But I'd be amongst the common ruffians. My parents were not educated. They were not rabbis, but they had a sense of themselves. I can't think of the proper Yiddish word. Doesn't matter. You lived a fine and dignified life. Most of the people around us were noisy and sat outside on the stoops in their undershirts. So I couldn't do those things. As it turned out, oh, I loved school. And though I was not the master of the streets, the second day I went to PS 122, I came home and said, I will walk to school by myself. 4 blocks, 2 avenues, past the big armory to PS 122. Going to school and coming back, the streets teemed with activity. Laundry delivered, big electric-driven trucks with chain drives. Oh, the bakeries. Duggan's delivering rolls, the milk from Sheffield Farm on Hayward Street. I even remember horse-drawn carts. The Italian vegetable and fruit man came with an old nag who was just 2 steps this side of the glue factory. And then there were so many other people. There were street singers. Oh, and I remember the cutler who ground knives. He would come peddling with a big stone wheel in front of him and a bell. He'd get in the middle of the block and hit that bell. All the mamas knew what that meant, and they came scurrying out of the houses with their aprons wrapped around scissors, knives, and the funny little chopping things that they used for soul food. Chopped liver. Oh, you could hear the whirring, the screeching noise, and see the sparks as the stone wetted with the metal. So, the streets were safe and full, still no bicycle, No roller skates, no scooter made of a stolen box attached to old roller skates. But the thing I craved most, because I loved books and reading, was a library card. The boarder taught me Hebrew when I was about 2. I puzzled out the Yiddish paper once I figured out you read it from back to front. And we didn't have much English in the house. But there were ketchup bottles. I knew that the books were in this big, very elegant building with red brick and limestone and marble, just a few blocks away near Eastern District High School and the YMCA, the civic center of that part of Williamsburg. But I couldn't get my mother to walk me over and get the library card, because anything involving public institutions reminded her of Brest in Poland, where every uniform meant danger, including the police. And every public office meant procrastination and insult and bribery and curses and humiliation. And of course, walking that way also took you to the elevated train on Broadway, or just a couple blocks more, that cooked the men like my father across the Williamsburg Bridge into Manhattan to work, as many of them did in the garment center. Oh, my father was a furrier. So 2 things frightened her: the men's world and the public world. And she wouldn't do it. But I came home from school one day, and I had the ultimate weapon. Teacher says. I listened to the teacher. I said, Mom, teacher says to get a library card. For some reason, you had to show a gas bill. I guess they thought maybe you could forge rental receipts. Maybe electricity was not as widespread as I thought. Or maybe it was democratic. Somebody who owned a house paid a gas bill, as well as somebody who rented. I don't know. But we took the gas bill over and found the appropriate desk. You had to be able to write your name or print it, and I was frightened because I never had the Spencerian copperplate hand that, of course, all the girls picked up. But with my tongue sticking out in concentration, I wrote my name, showed the gas bill, and got a temporary library card. 30 days later, the permanent card came. I don't think I took out picture books, because words were what I was interested in, and I would list them and go over to the big dictionary and schlep the pages over, looking for words. My parents in silent partnership with this great republic in which they had the most tenacious toehold, insecure in language, and so much of American ways, had gotten me, in that unlaminated card, my ticket out of ghetto-mindedness. Unknowingly, somewhat unwillingly, they had given me a chance to satisfy my curiosity. Such a powerful instinct for a lonely, lost, and rather sullen child. And with it, in time, after Dr. Dolittle and the boys' editions of Kipling and Stevenson and Victor Hugo, Alexander Dumas, ho, 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 and of course, Mark Twain. I haunted libraries. Oh, it was Dickens and Orwell and de Tocqueville, so that in time, and I'm proud of this, I'd achieved an independence of mind. And thanks to my humble, self-extinguishing parents, enough of the independence of spirit that has to sustain independence of mind. You know, a line of poetry, which I'm not much given to, came to me. It's a line of Shelley's, and I think my parents would have loved it. To hope and hope and hope, till hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates. They did. We must. And now, since we were late starting, that means I get a little bit of extra time, right? Well, microphone hasn't turned off, so I guess that's right. I'm going to read one more of these stories. And that'll be all for a while. But, like I said, I'm sorry. I love them all. Wanda Bullard wrote or told, "The Small Town Prisoner." You know, I'm going to tell you a story about my dad. His name was George Bullard. You know, he was born in rural areas, right up in the northeast corner of Mississippi, that most folks call British County. And the locals, they just call it paradise. He grew up with 8 other siblings on a farm. He married when he was 20, had 2 daughters, and his wife died. So he raised those 2 daughters. And after they were grown, he married my mother, who was about 20 years younger, and they had another family. So I am the last of the last. My dad was about 50 years old when I was born. Oh, but I was very fortunate to be raised by him. He raised and trained bird dogs all his life, and that's how he made his living. If the bird dog business got a little slow, he'd paint a house or 2 and do some things like that. But after he got up in his 60s, someone convinced him to get into politics. He ran for board of aldermen, which is like the city council, and he was elected by a landslide. Everybody loved him. His assignment was fire commissioner. Now, all the previous fire commissioners did was to go to meetings, make political decisions, but my father liked to get involved. So he went to the telephone company and said, "Can't y'all hook my telephone up with the one at the fire department?" So they did. And every time the fire department telephone rang, our phone rang. One long, continuous ring until you picked it up. And then you didn't talk. You just listened to see where the fire was so he could go. And he went to all the fires, day or night. He knew almost nothing about firefighting, but he knew how to encourage young men. So he'd go and encourage them. And I got involved because my father had almost stopped driving at night because of his age. And as a teenager, I had a driver's license. So I kept jeans and tennis shoes right there. And I drove him at 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, after a few turns as board alderman, several people, myself included, convinced him not to do that anymore. But he found he missed the camaraderie he had formed with all the firemen. And because the firemen and the police department were in the same building, he missed all the policemen too. So he would just go down there to visit every now and then again. And this being a small town, they worked out something which might not have been real legal, but they taught him how to operate the police radio. And anytime anybody wanted a day off or was sick, he'd go in and work an 8-hour shift. Somehow they managed to pay him. I don't know how. But one day he got to his job down at the police department and he discovered, to his amazement, they had a prisoner. Well, I did say it was a small town. It was most unusual. And that morning, he really didn't have much to do. He'd wander back and talk to this young man, and when he went out for lunch, he brought a couple of hamburgers back for him. Well, by 1 or 2 o'clock, he had made a decision about this young man. And he always trusted his instincts about people. He had decided that in spite of being long-haired, way down to here, which my father hated, that he was a decent young man. So he'd see if he could help him. He started to inquire of him, "Now, why are you still here? You seem like such a nice young man. Won't anyone come and get you out of jail?" The young man told him, "Well, I had a little too much to drink last night, and they arrested me for drunken disorder, and here I am." My dad said, "Well, what would it take to get you out?" And he said, "Well, I have to pay a $200 fine." And my dad said, "Well, can't your family pay the $200 fine?" He said, "Well, I think if I could talk to my father face to face, I could get the $200 from him, but I don't know how he's going to react to a collect call from the Boonville jail." Well, my dad mulled this over a little while. And he said, well, do you think if I turned you loose, you could go find your father and get the $200 and come back? Now, I'm going to remind you that my father's only duty was operating the police radio that talked back and forth with the cars. So the young man said, well, you see, I'm from Corinth, Mississippi, and that's about 20 miles north of Boonville. You know, they impounded my car. Now, I think I could get the money from my dad, but I got no way to get up there. My dad said, well, what would you say if I gave you your car? He said, they impounded it. And my daddy said, well, is it a blue Chevrolet? And he said, yes, sir. And then my daddy said, parked out in the parking lot, I can probably find the keys. So he scrounges round in the desk drawers and he finds the keys. And he not only releases the prisoner over whom he has no authority, he gives him a getaway car. Well, as the kid leaves, my father says, now, son, I believe if I could borrow $200 from my daddy, I'd borrow another $5 to get me a darn haircut. About 4 o'clock, policemen started coming back to change shifts. And as they came in, they went to the back, to check on the prisoner. And they discovered, to their dismay, they didn't have one. And they said, Mr. George, what happened to the prisoner? My daddy was busy doing his little closing up paperwork. And he said, oh, yeah. I turned him loose. And the police officer said, you did what? Turned him loose, he said. Mr. George, now why did you do that? Daddy said, well, he just seemed like a nice young man, and he'll be back in a little while with his $200. And the police officer was kind of taken back. He'd known my father all his life. My father was like a grandfather to most of those guys. He said, okay, well, we'll take care of this. He went back to the other policemen to try to figure out how they were going to get out of this without my father losing his unofficial job. And one of them says, well, we ought to remind the chief that George Bullard helped get him elected. But another of them said, oh, no, I got a better idea. Let's just tear up the paperwork. And we'll just pretend we never arrested the boy. Well, my father wouldn't hear of it. He said, oh, no. I know that boy's coming back. I know he is. And the police officer said, oh, how can you be so sure? You don't even know him. And my father's answer was simple. He told me he would. Well, they didn't know what to say to that. So they just didn't say anything. They waited around, and 4:30 came, and 5 o'clock. And of course, no young man returned. And about 5:15, they were trying to get my dad to go home, because his shift had ended at 5. He's kind of stoic. And he says, no, I'm going to wait around till he comes back. One of them observed, "Might be kind of a long wait." But no, my dad did not get discouraged. All of a sudden, the door opens, and the young man walks in. Plain cut, shaven, short hair, walks up to the counter, and they don't even acknowledge him because they're still mulling over what they're going to do to save my dad. And finally, the young man says, "Excuse me, I'd like to pay my fine." And that kind of got their attention. But they still didn't recognize him. And one of them walked to the counter and said, "What fine is it y'all talking about?" He said, "Well, you guys arrested me last night, locked me up. I owe 200, and I'm here to pay it." Started counting out $20 bills. And when he got to 200, the police didn't say a word, but they got out the book and wrote him out a receipt. They thanked him. The boy started to leave. When he got to the door to go out, he turned around, almost as if he knew what the situation was like there in that office with my dad, and said, "Oh, by the way, Mr. Bullard, I'm sorry I was late getting back, but I had to wait in line at the barber shop." Now, how's that for the moth taking wing? Now, if you enjoyed that story from the moth, and there are so many more just like it, exactly the same but different, right here in this book. And I want to remind you that by hearing about a book through Story and Song and purchasing a book at Story and Song, you're supporting Story and Song, and you're supporting independent businesses right here in Fernandina. Oh, we've got so many good things to share with you. Come, shop with us. I'll see you on Friday. No, Wednesday. Got my week mixed up. More poetry.